Here's the reason we chose this title for this series, okay? Here's the reason we chose it. Because we wanted to talk about, this is just the way I like to phrase it, we wanted to talk about something, we didn't know any real creative way to do it, but we did start talking about what is it like? What is it like for people to really understand what it is to be what I call, right? Show me the first line, in the middle, right? In the middle. They're not the beginning of any part of their journey. Maybe you are, but most people are not right at the beginning, and most people are not at the end. Okay? And we're not talking about, this is not a New Year's resolution kind of thing. Everybody's at the beginning, right, of the New Year's resolutions, the clean slate. I laughed. I think it was Jay. I'm going to pick on Jay, but he showed up like 3 days after. He was like, all right, sorry, already failed. The resolution's gone, And I was like, I get it. I'm that way too. I mean, it's not that resolutions are bad or, trying to start new things in January is, not a good thing because I think small wins and small victories are good. But we were talking about this idea that there is a life mission in all of us. There's a purpose that God's put in your heart. There's something that we're all called to do. And all of that happens, there's a beginning to it. Maybe we don't even remember the beginning anymore. And there's an end to it. We're not sure when the end is going to be there. And for most of the time, we get stuck sometimes just in the middle, not really sure of what God's doing, what he's not doing, and how do we take these opportunities like the January time frame and things that renew and opportunities to set new, smaller goals that maybe tie in to the much bigger mission and vision and goals and dreams that maybe you have in your life. And that's what we wanted to talk about in this series, is just what is it like to be in the middle? Because I know a lot of people that I talk to sometimes really struggle to feel productive, to feel successful, to feel like they've really accumulated or accomplished anything for God, for mission, whatever it may be. It could be for business, it could be for personal life. It doesn't matter. They just struggle when they're in the middle and they have a hard time seeing the beginning or the end anymore, right? It's like being out there in the middle of a lake, which is why I love the graphic. You can't really see the shore that you started, and you can't see where you're going anymore. And that's a tough place to be, all right? Now, I will tell you this. I'll have a thematic theme verse for all 3 weeks of the series because I really want us to focus on the big picture of what we've all been called to. This applies to everyone. And it comes from the author of Hebrews. The author of Hebrews was writing to the Jewish people who were struggling, right? They were struggling in the middle of their journey because they thought it was supposed to be the end. Many of the Jewish Christians in the early time after Christ and in the early part of the church, they were basically expecting Christ to return. He's not here yet, right? Is that, what I'm saying? Like they were expecting him to come like it's been 10 years and he's still not back. And it's been 20 years and it's been long. And they were struggling with the, wait. Is this working? Like, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Is this working? Is it worth it? Is it functioning? It's like the kids in the car. Are we there yet? Are we there yet, right? And I love the whole book of Hebrews because it's very much about the Christian faith, understanding that Jesus has set up a journey for all of us that is for the rest of our lives. And he goes on towards the end, and here's one of the great verses. Hopefully you maybe have seen this before, but we're going to look at this, and this is going to be our verse for the next few weeks that kind of amplifies the middle. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, who's the author and the perfecter of our faith. Matter of fact, we're all going to read it together. How about that? We're going to do a group exercise this morning. Let's read it together. Ready? Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. That the reality is that Jesus is not just the end goal. He's not just the end result, like heaven is just the end result. It's like, look, he's the author of all that you have and all that you've been given. And he is the end goal. All things end in him as well. But I love that last part where he says we're going to keep our eyes on him. Why? Because he's the perfecter of it. That Jesus promised that no matter where you are in the middle of, he is there in the middle of it with you. Okay? He is the one day by day, moment by moment, grunt by grunt, in the middle of whatever mess you feel like you're in or whatever success you feel like you're in. He is in the middle with you. So when you're between here and there, with your eyes fixed on him, he is not just the author and not just the end, but he is the perfecter. And he's the one with you in the middle. So as we talked about earlier, I do want to focus a little bit on just this big vision, big picture, okay? In terms of your life goal. Not necessarily that losing weight this year, that was your resolution, I want to lose 10 pounds. That's a great goal. I think we should all have that goal. I think we can all lose 10 pounds, right, and be a little happier, right? It's not a bad thing. I'm saying it from the standpoint of, a bigger life cause, if you will, in your life. And that you are probably, and most of us in here, you're probably in the middle of it. Now, this is something I want you to just think about. This is just a phrase. And this is a phrase I was thinking through as I thought about some books that I was reading and some things. And I said, every dream chaser, world changer, and difference maker, every one of their stories begins with a burden. Do you know that? You know that when Thomas Edison decided he wanted to figure out the whole light bulb thing, there was over 3,000 different thoughts that he put out on paper to try to figure out how to make that happen. There was over 1,000 experiments alone before he got anywhere close to a light bulb. But it didn't start with just a great idea. It started with a burden, if you will. Okay, Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream, right? He had a dream that there would be equality among races, among colors, among peoples. That we would be all equal in the sight of God as we were created. Mother Teresa, she had a burden. She had a burden that she didn't want the poor in Calcutta, the poor and the dying, to be alone, to feel unloved and to feel uncared for. We're talking about those big things, those dream chasers, those world changers, those difference makers. We can look at their story, and a lot of times we focus on the end result, and maybe we focus on, sometimes they may be the beginning, but we sometimes don't put ourselves, what was it like in the middle? What was like in the middle when they right there when Thomas Edison was on experiment 742, right? I mean, could you imagine the words you're saying in your internal dialogue in that moment, right? Because I know you think just like me, sometimes we don't put ourselves in the tension of what it was like in the middle. We don't oftentimes, we look at the end, sometimes the beginning, but mostly the end, mostly the results. Because we're all results-oriented, we're all outcome-oriented people. But the reality is all amazing outcomes, all dream chasers, all people that have done something significant in their life, they all started with a burden. They started with a desire that was sometimes unexplainable. Now, I believe when it comes to our grand purpose, our mission in life, when it comes to what maybe God has placed you here to do and to be for the remainder of your life, I believe that is also a burden, but I call it a God-given burden. That we have a God-given burden given to us by the Spirit that indwells us. That no matter where you are in life, and maybe you don't know how to describe it, maybe you don't know what that specific thing is, and we're going to talk through that over the next few weeks. But it starts with a burden. Most anything you're doing of significance, when you want to make changes that you believe are going to affect the rest of your life and other people's lives, it doesn't just start with hey, that'd be a good thing to do. Oh, hey, that'd be neat, right? It starts with something incredibly personal. It starts with something very deep. It starts with something that, again, sometimes you may have a hard time describing to someone else. And that is, for us as followers of Christ, something that I kind of phrase, and other people have phrased, a God-given burden in your life that begins all journeys, that begins all significant steps in your life to make changes for you, to make changes for others. And to run that race, as Hebrews says, to run this race that he's called us to with our eyes fixed on him. And again, I think sometimes when we're in the middle, we just sometimes need to be reminded of what our God-given burden is. When we're in the middle, maybe it's not just the middle of a project or a goal. Maybe you're just in the middle because you're like 40, like me, right? I'm just in the middle. Right? I'm in the middle of I've been following God since before I was born. I've been told by my parents, right? So I was following God for a long time. I'm in the middle of this quote-unquote life, at least I hope I am, right? I'm in the middle, and maybe for me, it's just also this place. I just need to go, why am I here? What am I doing? What is the purpose of this life? And is it tied to anything significant that I feel personally attached to, that I feel is bigger than me, that I feel a weight and responsibility to? And it's a God-given burden. Now I want to use it as an example as we walk through the next few weeks. I want to use a story in the Old Testament, a chronicle, really a journal. It's described as a memoir, is the best way to say it, kind of a biography, a memoir of a man's life named Nehemiah. And again, like all things, it's kind of hits on highlights and it hits on outcomes, but there's so many great things as you read the book of Nehemiah, as you read his memoirs, you begin to see, and we're going to look at just the first couple chapters today, you begin to see this burden take hold in his life, this place where God gives him a burden. And I think it gives us just some characteristics to see what entails a God-given burden, and do I have that right now? Is this something that I need to be reminded of, or I need to be praying for in my life? So Nehemiah 1 and 2 is where we're going to be focused, and here's kind of where I want to start. We're just going to read from the beginning of Nehemiah, because it kind of starts just right off the bat, and we'll kind of talk through these characteristics, all right? Nehemiah 1 says this: "These are the memoirs of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. In late autumn, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign." I was at the fortress of Susa. Just leave this here, just to give you some background. Where Nehemiah is in history is he is sitting in a place well after, if you think of the Old Testament stories, after the kingdom of Jerusalem and the kingdom of the Jewish people has already been split. They've already been conquered. They've both been conquered by this point. The Babylonians were the last to come in and fully conquer. And all of the Jews, as it was foretold, would be exiled to different corners of the earth. And in their exile, God would say, I want you to be here and to bless those around you. And I promise I'm going to still come and redeem that remnant. I'm still going to come and redeem my people. And in the midst of all that, the Babylonians, I'm not trying to get into history, but about 44, this is written in about 44 BC. By this point, Babylonians have been conquered by Syria, right? By the Persians, by Cyrus, sorry, not Syria. Cyrus, the Persians, and they rule for several hundred years before Alexander the Great comes along. So this is just kind of give you some timeline as to where we are. Now, by the time we begin, you can look at other stories like Esther, and you can look at Ezra and some other great stories where some movement has happened and the Jewish people have started to return to their homeland. God's already at work and moving to return people back to the land that was promised to them. And then we pick up Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah has a very significant story, but in the timeline, this is where he is. He is still someone born in captivity. He's living in the fortress of Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire right now, all right? And this is the 20th year. King Artaxerxes it's the reign right now. So let me keep going. I can't remember this one. Hananiah, I think it's name, is one of his brothers. He came to visit him with some other men who just arrived from Judah. So this is a team that kind of come back. I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and how things were going in Jerusalem. Very normal question, right? Hey, how's it going? What's going on? And they said to me, things are not going well for those who returned to the province of Judah. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. When I heard all this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days, I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. Just from that report, in Nehemiah's sort of journaling and this aspect, he says, look, I got this news from a brother and some friends of mine. I got this news, and I was absolutely broken for the people of Judah. I was absolutely broken for my people there. I was broken for the city. And what this tells me, especially when we start talking about this idea of God-given burdens, there's just one characteristic, I believe, is that these things that come to us, they're very personal. That's really the first thing. It's very personal. For you and for me. It's something that's deeper than, again, it's something deeper than just a good thing to do or a nice thing for people or something that would be something that we should all kind of care about at a certain level. This is something that he says, for days I wept and I mourned, and he was completely broken over. Which is, again, something you would read or see about something that would affect someone extraordinarily personally. And the reality is that this did not affect Nehemiah personally. I mean, in terms of how we view something personal. Our home, our job, maybe our family, our kids, our spouses. We would all see people react if it hit home to a certain degree that it was very personal. But this is something that you see happen in his life that may not personally, circumstantially affect him, and yet he is moved on a personal level, deeply emotional, deeply broken over the plight of this other place, over the plight of really his people, but his people probably who some of them he hadn't even met. And I believe this is a big characteristic. Because for you and for me, there's something about the personal brokenness of our life that drives us to do a lot of things. It drives us to make decisions. It drives us towards certain passions. It drives us towards certain compassions in our life because we are personally broken and affected by something. And again, maybe it is personal. Maybe it's for your family. Maybe it's something that logically people can connect the dots. But I'm just letting you know, kind of from experience and history, conversations I have with people that have experienced kind of a God-given burden, sometimes it has nothing to do with them. It has nothing to do with them. Sometimes it's something that the Holy Spirit just places in your heart and soul and breaks you and gives you a personal connection over that you sometimes, again, have a very hard time explaining to someone else. That you are so moved by it. Every time you get into a conversation about it, you tear up a little bit. Every time, that's for women. For men, every time you get into a conversation, you start coughing and excuse yourself, right? Because there's something in your soul that as you kind of begin to get around the borders of those things, something moves and breaks within you like a tuning fork inside, and you realize that it's something deeply personal to you. And sometimes we just have a hard time handling it. We don't know sometimes how to handle it. And I believe it's because the Spirit, again, this is a God-given burden. The Spirit that indwells us is the thing in us breaking our hearts over it. It's the thing in us, and it's how you can have a conversation. Let's just give you an example. It's how you can have a conversation with somebody. And you can be talking about, let's just talk about something that's happening overseas, and you can be having conversations with all believers, all Christians, all people claiming to love God, and they would talk about something that's very, very bad happening in an area, and one person is completely a mess. And there's three more that are bothered, but only to a certain degree. Have you guys ever experienced this in life before? Why? Because there is someone who it is personally attacking and personally bothering as if they themselves were there, as if their wife was in the midst, as if their children were present. It's so personal. And yet some can just have that same conversation and it'd be very, very on the surface. It can be very, very, it's bad, but it's not something that breaks them the same way. Because a God-given burden that's personal breaks us. And this is just a question. Obviously, we're going to ask this question later, but do you have anything personal in your life that you feel broken over? I mean, it's not the easiest question to ask, this kind of shortened the message, but do you? Do you have something that maybe isn't even connected to you that you have the most difficult time processing and dealing with emotionally because you're a mess when it comes to that? You really are so unbelievably moved that you almost don't know what to do. You almost don't know what to do. That's where it begins. That's just one characteristic of a God-given burden in your life. Is that it's going to be personal. He's going to make it, I promise you. If you're in line with the Spirit, He's going to make it personal for you. One of the other characteristics is that it's God-sized, okay? And I mean this from a standpoint of, obviously, it's God-given, so therefore it is God-sized. It's usually something much bigger than you, that you can handle, that you can do on your own. And so I want to read through his prayer. This is just a response, again, in Nehemiah 1. The only reason I want you to read the prayer is because I could probably just summarize it, but it's so powerful to see how it affects the way in which he prays. Let's go to his prayer. This is in verse 5. He says, I said, Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of unfailing love with those who love him and obey his commands. Listen to my prayer. Look down and see me praying night and day for your people, Israel. I confess that we have sinned against you. Yes, even my own family and I have sinned. We have sinned terribly by not obeying the commands, decrees, and regulations that you gave us through your servant Moses. Please remember what you told your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful to me, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commandments and live by them, then even if you are exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place that I've chosen for my name to be honored. The people you rescued by your great power and strong hand are your servants, O Lord. Please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those, right? Of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. And he ends this with this, in those days, I was the king's cupbearer. This is important. I'll explain this in a minute, but he kind of wants to let you know this is his prayer, but this is who he really is in the grand scheme of things. Now, he asks, God, would you help the king be favorable? Would you make it favorable for him to grant me a request that he's going to bring before the king? By the way, I'm just the cupbearer. And one of the reasons I believe that's important to say, hey, I'm just the cupbearer, is because Nehemiah just acknowledges and wants everybody who reads this to acknowledge that, look, he is not King Artaxerxes. Right? He doesn't wield the power to solve this problem. He is an insignificant speck in the grand scheme of life. He is a slave in Susa, regardless of whether or not he is the king's. You know what a cupbearer does, by the way? Do you have any idea what a cupbearer does? Yeah, he's the first one to die if the king's poisoned. I just want you to know that, right? That's what a cupbearer does. He's responsible for the king's drink. He has to taste it, check it, make sure it's good, keeps a lot of protection around it so that the king can be safeguarded. But guess who dies first if poison gets in the water or gets in the wine? The cupbearer, right? Not talking about job security. That's a tough one to have. But he goes on, and you just see his prayer. Because I believe, this is what I believe. I believe that when you have a God-sized burden, it is so big that it's impossible for you to do anything but pray that God would do something for you. It's so big for you, in you, that you have no choice but to have it affect your prayer life, because there's absolutely nothing you feel like you can do ultimately to end or solve what the burden is on your heart. You have to pray differently because it's God-sized. Now, you might have a part in it. Again, we're going to look at this over the next few weeks. You're going to have a part in it. You're going to have a place there. But when it comes to just the burden, it feels massive. And it changes the way you pray. And you have to somewhat acknowledge who you are. Like Nehemiah. Hey, I'm just the cupbearer over here, right? I'm just so-and-so. Like, God, you put the burden in me, but you know who I am. I'm not all of that. I'm this. And you begin to really be resized, especially in a God-sized burden. When it's God-sized, you begin to get resized as to who you are, but not only who you are, but who God is. That he ultimately is the one who has placed this burden in you, therefore he is also the one who has an answer, who can solve it. Again, I love the way Nehemiah says, hey, you did say that if we did this, you would scatter us, but you also said that if we came back, that you would bring us back. That God, you and your power, you are the awesome God, you would do this for us. Now, let me just tell you what usually happens. And this is the saddest part of most people in their Christian walk and journey, is that they get to a place in their life where God breaks their heart over something that is so personal, but it's so God-sized that they shut God down and harden their heart because they don't have a clue how their life could possibly make a difference. They don't have any idea how me, just a cupbearer, could do anything to solve this problem. And so they harden their hearts and they shut God down from that conversation. And they spend the rest of their life with little tiny goals and little tiny things and kind of moving on the way that they can control and they can control the outcomes of, and they can do that. And every once in a while they'll rub up against it and their heart will start to feel that tug. And they're like, they know with that tug comes a God-sized burden, and they can't do anything, and they get worried about it and they get nervous about it. So they shut it down. Because it's God-sized. It's God-sized. It's something that's so big that many of us feel absolutely powerless. And so instead of praying, instead of changing the way we pray, instead of changing the way we approach God, instead of changing and engaging in this God-sized burden and this God-given burden, a lot of times when it becomes God-sized, I'm just telling you, it's our nature, because we can't control it and we can't solve it, and because we're such a small piece of it, we just shut it down. We shut it down. We turn it off. Maybe that's where some of you guys are today. I don't know. I can tell you that if you go the route of praying differently, if you go the route, then Another piece of this, another characteristic of often of a God-given burden is it becomes something that you feel responsible for. There's responsibility that comes, right? Isn't that my third one? Yeah, responsibility that comes along with it. Now, why do I say that? Well, I'm going to give you some summary and then we're going to jump into the passage. But he goes to the king. And he doesn't know how to bring up the conversation, but he is so personally saddened and moved. The king actually looks at him and goes, dude, what's up with your face? Like, this is the Matt paraphrase, okay, of this. All right, he says, dude, like, you are a droopy dog. What is going on, right? The king knows him. And Nehemiah just says, dude, I can't. Oh, he didn't say dude, but you know what I'm saying? He's like, how can I not be broken? And he tells him the plight. And then he makes the request and says, King, would you send me? Would you send me there so that I can help in any way that I can help? And as you read on the beginning of chapter 2, you read that the king says, yes. Yes, not only will I send you, I'm going to make you the governor of Judah. Okay, now, we're talking about a big shift here. From I'm just a cupbearer to now he says, hey, Nehemiah, you're the governor of Judah. You are now in charge on behalf of me as the king. Now, because of his state and because of other things that were going on, there was a condition. The king did request, look, I want you to go, you can help, you can do it, but guess what? You can't stay. He wanted him to return. There was a condition on it. He says, look, this is not a forever thing. This is just a momentary thing. I want you to be able to come back. That's got to be a promise that you make to me, that you'll return. But in addition to just outside of that condition, basically the king gives him everything. King gives him letters. King gives him like authority. He gives him like all the permissions of what he need to do to gather stuff and get everything ready to go and help the people there. Talk about responsibility that comes immediately after he makes that request. But let's go on to actually read. He does end up making his way to Jerusalem. He's getting everything ready. And so here we go. I want you to guys see this. I arrived in Jerusalem 3 days after I slipped, or 3 days later, I slipped out during the night, taking only a few others with me. I had not told anyone about the plans God had put in my heart for Jerusalem. So he didn't come in declaring what he was going to do. He actually came in a little bit under kind of on the slide, just like, hey guys, there's a new governor of Judah that the king has appointed. And he shows up. And 3 days later, he slips out. Slips out in the night, it says, and you'll go on to see a little bit later. I'm not going to read those verses, but he spends some time inspecting the walls and the gates. This is a big deal for him. Again, God, I think, had placed this in his heart, not just a burden for the whole, because he does more than just rebuild a wall, which is the story of Nehemiah. He does more than that, but he goes out to survey what's really going on, and he goes and looks at the walls and the gates, and he goes, and we're going to talk more about this the next couple of weeks in detail, so I kind of wanted to, save time today. But he goes to inspect the walls and the gates before he ever says anything to anyone. And then when he comes back, here's what he says. The city officials didn't know I'd been out there or what I was doing, for I had not yet said anything to anyone about my plans. And he says, I had not yet spoken to the Jewish leaders, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or anyone else in administration. He bypassed all the authority that was in place just so he could get a handle on what was coming. And then here's where he starts saying, he says to them, you guys know, very well what trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem and end this disgrace. That I told them about how the gracious hand of God had been on me and about my conversation with the king. Now, I love the two sides of this responsibility coin because, yes, in one side, he is given responsibility, right? And a lot of times we don't know sometimes what we ask God for. So again, we talked about this, I think, a while back, but it's like every time we think we're asking God for more or to solve something or to help us with something, we may not actually understand that all he might do is just give us something to be responsible for, something that we are more now responsible for than we were before. And that's the case of Nehemiah's story. He goes from the cupbearer to the governor of Judah, and now he is responsible for all that's going to happen. But I love the responsibility he places on this because of the burden in him. That he looks at the people, and he's the governor now. He could basically just delegate. He could just tell them what to do. But he goes on to say, look, you guys already know the trouble that we are in, you and me. that we're in now. We're all in this together. And then he goes on to say, hey, let us rebuild. Let us rebuild. Now, we know this from the story. It's a big deal to rebuild, and it's a massive undertaking. But even Nehemiah, just by the life he lives, we know what he meant when he said this. Let us rebuild means, this is not something I can delegate to you or tell you what to do. No, I have to come and be a part of this. I had to come here and have some part in what God has placed on my heart to do. There is a weight. I just want you to hear this. There is a weight that comes with a God-given burden. There's a weight that comes on us. It's heavy. It's something, again, that's if we don't shut it down because it's God-sized. And that's if we're open emotionally to the fact that it's gonna break us personally. But when all that's said and done, another big characteristic, it's weighty. It's something that weighs on us. It's a responsibility. It's something that you have to engage in. Not that you can solve it on your own. Not that you may lead something to solve it. You may have to connect with 85,000 other organizations and people, and it may be a lifetime of searching and working. But all you know is that you are going to have a stake in it at some point. Because it's something that God's placed in you. It is a weight. It is a responsibility for you to engage. For you to do something. So I love that not only does he feel responsible, but he is also given the responsibility that he asked for, that he requested from the king. Now, with all this said and done, because I'm keeping us kind of at this today, because I don't want to move past this depending on where you are in your life. It's the question of just, do you have a God-given burden? Like, what is it in your life? And these are just things to think through. Is it personal? Is it God-sized? Is it something bigger than you? Is it something you feel a weight of responsibility for? These are just things that help you filter and ask the questions. What is the God-given burden for my life's mission, my life's purpose? Everything I'm doing to breathe and exist and be here, what is it? Now, maybe for you, maybe you don't have one because you're not yet a follower of Jesus. You're not yet a follower of God. Well, that's your first step. You want to have a God-given burden, you got to be with God. Does that make sense to everybody, right? So that's something you have to do. That's a step, that's the pre-step, okay? But if you already are a follower of Christ, then for you, you're either in the middle of it, like many of us. Maybe you've accomplished some things, and maybe he's giving you a new burden. You're maybe at the beginning again. Maybe you shut things down because they were too big, and once it was God-sized for you, you just had to close it off because you didn't know what to do. Maybe you closed off the fact that it was personal because there was so much other stuff in your life personally that you just couldn't handle. I don't know where you are or what you believe that answer to that question is, but this is the question I'm leaving you with today. What is your God-given burden for your life? And the reason I'm asking that is because when we're in the middle of things, when we are in the middle, we oftentimes just need to remember. We just have to sometimes remember what is that thing that personally drives us. What is that thing that is so much bigger than sometimes we have to scale it down so that we can try to control it be? What's that thing that I feel the weight of? And sometimes I have to just distract myself so I don't feel the weight of it as much as it should. I have to live my life with some distractions. What is that? Because sometimes you just need to remember so you can get back on track, right? Sometimes you need to remember so you can show up in a January like now and be like, well, here's my resolutions for the year. I'm going to read this many books. I'm going to lose 10 pounds, I'm going to stop drinking and cussing and smoking and all the other things that we say we're not going to do anymore. Liars, right? Okay? And I don't think all those things are bad. I'm just saying, how does it tie to a God-given burden in your life? Does it? Is it? What is it? As a church, this is where I was even thinking through as a church. As a church, we use the word hope, right? We use the word hope. Because that for us is the emotional language of what personally breaks us as a church. Our church responds from a personal level that we understand that people, there's a lot of logical barriers and a lot of things that people think and have trouble with and struggle with when it comes to Christianity and religion, and we understand it, but we know without an absolute shadow of a doubt that people want to feel hope in their life, in their marriage, in their jobs, in their finances, in their friendships, in their relationships. They want to feel hope. And we know that there's an absolute hope available in the person of Christ. There's an absolute hope that's there. It's why it's personal for us. It's why it's God-sized for us, right? There's 89,000 unchurched people in an 8-mile radius of this address. 89,000. This is the reason that we as a church don't view other churches as competition, right? Why? Because we can't do that. That's God-sized. We can't solve that. It doesn't matter how good the music is or the marketing or anything else. We can't solve that. We have to partner with other churches in this area to even see a fraction of a tipping point come so that we can continue to see God do a revival and a work in this city, in this community. That's our desire. That's our God-sized understanding that there's so much more than what we can do. Therefore, we have no choice but to pray for other churches and link arm with other churches to help our community in any way that we can. It's why that we feel a weight to it. It's the reason we say yes to things and no to things as a church. We say yes to things and no to things and filter programs and other things that we do based on the fact that we want to continue to focus on what does it look like to point people to absolute hope, to humbly point others to absolute hope. What does that look like for us, and how can we do that better this year than we did last year? But personally, guys, it has to be there in each one of you. Not just that vision, because that's a vision of us corporately. That's our mission corporately, as why we feel we gather as a church. But that comes out in you and me living out the God-sized burden that we've been given individually. And listen, it doesn't take long. If you spend some time engaging at this church, you will run into someone, you will rub shoulders with people who are well in tune and in touch with their God-sized burden. Just have a conversation with them about whatever, global outreach or local mission or, discipleship, or it doesn't matter. You're going to find someone and you're going to recognize, oh, I know what yours is, right? You're probably already thinking of that in your mind right now. What I want you to do today is just spend a little bit more time thinking about what's yours. What's yours? What's that bigger purpose in your life? When did it start for you as to be a burden? When was that burden revealed? Is there a way in which you can go back and maybe just remember? Remember how it personally breaks you. Remember the size that it is. Remember that the reason you engage in it, the reason you are a part of it is because you feel and you've been given responsibilities by God to engage in it. I can tell you this is where I wanted to end today. That between here and there, when we're in the middle, I know that our God-given burdens help keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. That if that's been an issue for you in your life, if you've had a hard time, and this is like you're coming back to church because we need to get back to church, right? All that happens in January. Church experiences the same surge the gym does, right? We got to get back to church. I understand. I'd rather you ask the question, do I have a burden? Is it there? Maybe I have one, and the reality is I need to get back to church, and I need to get back to faith, and I need to get back to understanding because I need to remember what that burden is and keep my eyes fixed on Jesus so I can continue to make steps towards it. That's what I want you to think about today. As we move into the next few weeks and we talk a little bit more about what that middle looks like for most of us. Let's pray together this morning. God, I'm so thankful for the way in which your word challenges us. And this morning, for those online and those here and engaged in this kind of snowy, icy day, God, could you just help us in this small moment that we take as we all individually pray today, God? First and foremost for those, God, today that have yet to surrender their life to you. God, I pray that they would do that. I pray they would make that decision today. But God, getting back to you is really a first step. It's actually a step to say, God, I haven't, the things that I've done my way are not working. God, I need you, and I need the gift of your Son that can redeem my life. God, I pray that they would just say that simple prayer. God, take me as one of your own. May they sacrifice everything and leave it behind and follow you with a passion. That's our first step. But God, I pray that even in all of us today, as we're praying through this idea of a God-given burden, that God, you'll just begin to nudge us. Hopefully you've already been doing it. Your Spirit's been at work this whole time, nudging and poking and prodding. And as I've said things like burdens and God size and personal and responsibility, you've been just nudging and pulling on people's hearts to remind them of the burden you gave them. And God, I pray that they would not shut it down today. I pray that, God, they would not turn it off emotionally, that they would not shut it down and harden their hearts, that they would not shy away from the responsibility, not only that you want to give them, but the responsibility and the weight they feel to get involved. Maybe this is their year to take some steps they've been afraid to take. God, would you just reveal that to us? And that, God, as we make plans this year, as we push forward into a brand new year, would you allow and help us with our little goals, with those little things? I believe in those little goals. I believe in those yearly, vision statements and tasks and goals, the one words that help us kind of filter and move in our year. God, I believe in those things because I believe you can use those things to align our gifts and our talents and our passions to the burden that you've given us. And that, God, while we're all in the middle of this journey, that we would remember to keep our eyes fixed on you. That you just didn't start the journey for us, God, but that you are the perfecter. You are the one that walks with us moment by moment, emotion by emotion, day by day, choice by choice, perfecting our faith in you. God, we thank you in all this, and we pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen.